Richard Jones clutched the eviction notice as he walked through the doors of Pinnacle Storage Solutions. His last paycheck, barely enough to cover 2 weeks of rent. The bankruptcy from his failed construction business had stripped away everything: his house, his truck, his wife's trust. Now he worked night security at a storage facility on the outskirts of town, watching over other people's abandoned dreams. The facility manager, Mrs. Chen, waited by the front desk with her usual unreadable expression. She was a small woman in her 60s who spoke with careful precision, as if every word carried weight. "Unit 247 needs special attention tonight," she said, handing him a clipboard with detailed instructions. "The renter moved out last week but left behind some items. They'll be collected tomorrow. But until then, you check on that unit every 2 hours. No exceptions." Richard scanned the list. The rules seemed excessive. Maintain visual contact with the unit door at all times during checks. Never enter alone. Report any temperature changes immediately. And document everything in writing. "What kind of stuff did they leave?" he asked. Mrs. Chen's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Collectibles. Some people become very attached to their toys." She paused at the door. "My grandmother always said certain objects hold onto the energy of their owners. Sometimes that energy doesn't want to let go." The first few hours passed normally. Richard made his rounds, checking locks and logging temperatures. Unit 247 sat in the far corner of Building C, isolated from the main clusters of storage units. During his 10 p.m. check, he noticed the temperature gauge read 3 degrees colder than the surrounding units. At midnight, he returned with his flashlight and logbook. The beam illuminated rows of boxes and furniture covered in white sheets, but in the center sat a small display case containing what looked like collectible dolls. One caught his attention: a pale figure with oversized black eyes and small fangs, dressed in a pink hoodie. A Labubu doll, he realized, recognizing it from his daughter's toy catalogs before the divorce. As he wrote down the temperature reading, a soft thud echoed from inside the unit. Richard froze, listening. Storage units settled sometimes, especially when temperature fluctuations affected the metal. But this sound had been deliberate, like something falling over. He aimed his flashlight back at the display case. The Labubu doll sat exactly as before, its glassy eyes reflecting the light. But something felt different. He couldn't identify what. The next night brought more peculiarities. During his 8 p.m. round, Richard found his radio crackling with static whenever he approached Unit 247. His flashlight dimmed despite fresh batteries. And the cats that usually roamed the facility grounds were nowhere to be seen. At 10 p.m., he unlocked the unit door and stepped back as protocol required. His breath formed visible puffs in the suddenly frigid air. The Labubu doll sat in its case, but now it faced slightly toward the door instead of straight ahead. Richard blinked hard, certain his exhaustion was playing tricks on him. 36 hours without proper sleep could make anyone see things. He photographed the doll's position with his phone, noting the time and angle for his report. 2 hours later, the doll had moved again. This time, it faced him directly, those black eyes seeming to track his movement as he aimed the flashlight beam across the unit. Richard's hands shook as he took another photo, comparing it to the previous image. The difference was undeniable. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "She knows about the money you took from the pension fund. Richard's blood went cold. The loan from his company's employee pension fund had been his desperate final attempt to save the business. Nobody knew about that except his accountant, who had died in a car accident 3 months ago, and his ex-wife. Another text appeared. "Sarah thinks you're pathetic." He tried calling the number, but it went straight to a disconnected line. His GPS showed no signal, though the storage facility sat only 5 miles from downtown. Even his emergency radio produced only static. The third night, Richard arrived with backup batteries and a camera with night vision. He'd spent the day researching Labubu dolls online, learning they were created by a Hong Kong artist, and had become collectible toys across Asia. Nothing suggested any supernatural properties. But Mrs. Chen's grandmother had been from Hong Kong. During his first check, Richard found the display case open. The Labubu doll sat on the edge, tiny legs dangling over the side. Its head had turned toward the unit entrance, as if waiting for him. He tried to convince himself someone was playing an elaborate prank. But the storage facility's security cameras covered every entrance, and his key card showed no other access to Building C. He was alone with whatever was happening in Unit 247. The temperature dropped to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. At midnight, the doll had moved to the floor. It sat cross-legged beside an old photo album, its position suggesting it had been looking through the pages. Richard knelt carefully outside the unit threshold and aimed his flashlight at the open album. The photos showed a young Asian woman with a collection of toys and dolls arranged around her in various apartments and bedrooms. In several images, the same Labubu doll sat prominently displayed, always in a place of honor. The woman looked happy in the early photos, but as Richard flipped through pages with a stick from outside the unit, her appearance grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. The final photos showed her alone in what looked like the same storage unit, surrounded by boxes and staring directly at the camera with an expression of profound despair. His phone buzzed. She died here 3 weeks ago. They found her Tuesday morning. Richard's construction experience kicked in. He could recognize the signs of someone living rough. The arrangement of furniture in the unit, the makeshift bathroom set up behind a partition, the stockpiled food containers. Someone had been living in Unit 247. Another text. The dolls were all she had left. Her family disowned her. Sound familiar? Richard backed away from the unit, his pulse hammering. The last text hit too close to his own situation. His parents had stopped returning his calls after the bankruptcy. His sister refused to co-sign an apartment lease. Even his brother had lent him money with the clear expectation it would never be repaid. On the fourth night, Richard arrived with a crowbar and portable heater. If something was manipulating the temperature and electronics around Unit 247, he would fight back with basic tools and determination. His construction crew had always relied on him to solve impossible problems with practical thinking. The Labubu doll now sat directly in the doorway, blocking his entrance to the unit. Richard set up the portable heater and aimed it at the doll. The temperature gauge climbed slowly from 40 degrees to 50, then 55. As the air warmed, the doll's plastic seemed to soften slightly and its position shifted backward. At 60 degrees, he heard a sound like air escaping from a balloon, followed by what could only be described as a sigh. His phone screen lit up with a rapid series of texts, all from different numbers, but with similar messages. Don't make us leave. She's all alone now. The cold keeps the sadness away. We just want to play, like she used to. Richard realized the truth with horrible clarity. The woman in the photos hadn't just been living in the storage unit, she had died here, surrounded by the only companions she had left. And somehow, her desperate loneliness had infected her collection, particularly the doll she'd treasured most. But loneliness was something Richard understood. The crushing isolation of financial ruin, the way people disappeared from your life when you couldn't provide stability or entertainment. He'd spend months talking to his tools on job sites, pretending they were old friends who still cared about his opinions. I know what it feels like, he said to the doll, feeling foolish but continuing anyway. But she's not coming back, and keeping her trapped here isn't helping either of you. The doll's head tilted slightly, as if listening. Richard pulled out his phone and showed the screen to the doll. Look, I'm going to call someone, a collector or a toy store. Someone who will appreciate what you are and give you a proper home. But you have to let her go. He started researching local toy collectors, making actual phone calls despite the late hour. The third number reached an elderly man who specialized in designer vinyl toys and was willing to meet him in the morning. As he spoke to the collector, explaining he had a Labubu doll that needed a good home, Richard noticed the temperature in the unit gradually rising. The doll remained motionless, but its expression seemed less intense, more resigned than angry. One condition, Richard said to the empty air. No more haunting security guards, okay? Find someone who actually wants to play. The next morning, Mrs. Chen arrived as Richard loaded the display case into the collector's van. The elderly man had been delighted to acquire the doll, explaining it was a rare variant he'd been seeking for years. The unit cleaned out easier than expected, Mrs. Chen observed. Sometimes things just need to find where they belong, Richard replied. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. My grandmother would have liked that answer. She handed him an envelope. Your final paycheck, plus a bonus for handling a difficult situation with wisdom. The bonus was enough to cover first month's rent on a small apartment. Not much, but enough to start over without living in his car. As Richard drove away from Pinnacle Storage Solutions for the last time, he glanced in his rearview mirror. For just a moment, he thought he saw a small figure waving from the window of the collector's van. A final goodbye from someone who understood what it meant to be left behind. His phone buzzed with one last text from an unknown number. Thank you. 6 months later, Richard had steady work with a new construction company and a modest apartment he could afford. He still woke up sometimes at 2 a.m., listening for unexplained sounds, but they never came. Some experiences left permanent marks on your sleep schedule and your trust in the ordinary world. He kept the photos from the storage unit in a folder on his phone, not as evidence but as a reminder. Loneliness could consume people in ways that transcended death, but it could also be broken by someone simply caring enough to listen. The collector had sent him updates about the Labubu doll. It now sat in a place of honor in the man's shop, surrounded by other toys and frequently admired by customers. Children often pointed at it and smiled, drawn to its distinctive appearance. Richard had learned something valuable in Unit 247. Sometimes the most practical solution to supernatural problems was the most human one. Connection, understanding, and finding where broken things belonged. His ex-wife had been wrong about one thing. He wasn't pathetic. Pathetic would have been running away from a problem he could actually solve. Though he still avoided storage facilities, and he'd never look at collectible dolls quite the same way again. 6 months later, Richard's new routine had settled into comfortable predictability until the collector called on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with concern. "The Labubu doll," the old man said without preamble. "Something's changed. Customers are complaining about cold spots near the display case, and yesterday I found it facing the window instead of the shop entrance." Richard's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. "Have you moved it recently?" "That's just it. I haven't touched the case in weeks. But it's not just the position. Children who used to smile at it now walk past quickly. One little girl started crying and said the doll looked sad and hungry." The familiar chill crept up Richard's spine. "I'll come take a look." The toy shop occupied a narrow storefront in the arts district, crammed floor to ceiling with vintage collectibles and designer vinyl figures. The Labubu doll sat in its place of honor behind glass, but Richard immediately noticed the temperature difference. At least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the shop. "When did this start?" Richard asked, studying the doll's position. It faced the street window, black eyes fixed on the sidewalk beyond. "About 3 weeks ago, right after that news story ran about the storage facility murders." Richard's blood chilled. "What murders?" The collector pulled up a local news website on his tablet. The headline made Richard's stomach drop. 3 bodies found in Pinnacle storage facility. Police investigate connection to missing persons cases. The article described the discovery of 3 decomposed bodies in different storage units, all appearing to have lived in the spaces before dying of exposure and malnutrition. Police suspected a pattern of people using storage facilities as last resort housing, isolated and forgotten until it was too late. Unit 247 was mentioned, the collector said quietly. "Where you found the doll." Richard scrolled through the article, recognizing the woman from the photo album in the police description. But there were 2 other victims, both found in units that had been rented for months, with no contact from the renters. "She's calling them," Richard realized with growing horror. "The doll! She's drawing other lost people to join her." As if responding to his words, the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Frost began forming on the inside of the display case glass. The collector backed away from the case. "What do we do?" Richard's construction instincts kicked in again, but this time he understood the real problem. The doll hadn't been the source of the haunting, it had been the anchor. The woman's loneliness had attached itself to her most prized possession, and now that loneliness was growing stronger, feeding on similar desperation in others. "We can't destroy it," Richard said, thinking aloud. "That would just scatter the energy, make it harder to contain. But we can't leave it here to keep influencing people." His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "More friends coming soon. She won't be alone anymore." "It's not just about the doll," Richard continued, his understanding crystallizing. "It's about breaking the cycle, people dying forgotten and alone, the desperation infecting places and objects." He pulled out his phone and started making calls to homeless shelters, social services, community outreach programs. If loneliness was feeding the haunting, then the solution was connection on a larger scale. "What are you doing?" the collector asked. Something I should have done 6 months ago, Richard replied. I helped one lonely spirit find peace, but I didn't address why she died alone in the first place. Within 2 hours, Richard had organized volunteers to check on isolated tenants at storage facilities across the city. Social workers agreed to establish regular wellness visits. A local church offered to create a support network for people facing eviction or homelessness. As the volunteer coordinator confirmed the first scheduled visits, Richard watched the frost on the display case begin to melt. The doll's position shifted slightly, its expression seeming less desperate. But the real test came that evening. Richard returned to find the shop's temperature normal, the doll facing forward in its usual position. His phone remained silent. No mysterious texts, no supernatural communications. The collector smiled for the first time that day. Whatever you did, it worked. Richard nodded, but he knew this was just the beginning. The supernatural problems had been symptoms of larger human failures. The way society abandoned people who became inconvenient or expensive to help. I'm starting a foundation, he told the collector. Using my construction connections to create affordable housing solutions and partnering with social services for support networks. The doll sat peacefully in its case, no longer a vessel for desperate loneliness, but simply a toy waiting for the next child to admire its unique charm. Richard had learned the most important lesson of all. Some hauntings could only be ended by preventing the conditions that created them in the first place.